A common bit of advice given to those who find themselves on a long walk through the woods: stop and look at where you've been so you don't get lost. In a sense, that is what we are doing here. We are looking back to see where our community has been so we don't get lost in making our way into the future.
We don't pretend to give a comprehensive history of Deland or Stetson or to even stick too closely to a timeline. What we aim to do is to present moments and remembrances of the past in the words of those who lived them, not to tell a story, but more to piece together a collage, to give an impression of some of the lives lived here in our little corner of Florida.
We are not trained historians. We are actors, or better, reenactors. We got to know some of the people through our own history books, and now we pass them on to you.
Pinning down the moment that West Volusia County, Florida took shape is not easy. What is a beginning? Like the rest of the Americas, Florida had original indigenous inhabitants who are now extinct or absorbed into other tribes. The West Volusia inhabitants were known as the Mayaka. Their principal village was located on the east side of the St. Johns River, across from what is now Astor, although Mayaka settlements extended past Pontoon Island into areas further south. The Mayaka village was later known as the town of Volusia, from which our county gets its name. All that remains of the town is a historical marker, a residential neighborhood, and a marina. Not many people know about this early history. We didn't until we started looking.
Another thing most people around here don't know in 2021 is that a couple of hundred years ago, there were 2 slave plantations in West Volusia County. One was called Spring Garden, and some architectural remains can still be seen in the Leon Springs State Park. The other was the Beresford Plantation, located on the eastern shore of Lake Beresford.
These plantations are mentioned in the memoirs of 2 rather famous people from a time before the founding of Deland. John James Audubon visited Spring Garden, and William Bartram visited Beresford. In Bartram's book, Travels, he describes a trip up the St. Johns River before finally arriving at Lake Beresford, after surviving alligators and a hurricane.
The farm is situated on the east shore of the beautiful Long Lake, which is about 2 miles long and near a mile broad, and it communicates with the St. Juan. By the river which I ascended, it is perhaps a mile and a half long and 30 or 40 meters wide. The river, as well as the lake, abounds with plentiful amounts of fish and wild fowl of various kinds.
When I arrived, my friend was affrighted to see me, and immediately inquired of me in what manner I came there, supposing it impossible, until I showed him my boat, that I should arrive by water through so tremendous a hurricane. But what is incredible is that through all this devastation and ruin, providentially no lives were lost. Although there were about 60 Negro slaves on the plantation, and most of them in their huts when the storm came on. Yet they all escaped with their lives, although several were badly wounded.
Having heard of a certain spring near the sources of St. Johns River in East Florida, I decided to visit it in order to judge for myself. The weather was pleasant, but not so our way. And the sand seemed to be all sand and nothing but sand. And the palmettos at times so covered the narrow Indian trail which we followed that it took all the instinct or, sagacity of ourselves to keep it. Seemed like we were approaching the end of the world.
But at length we perceived the tracks of living beings, and soon after saw the huts of Colonel Reese's Negroes. Scarcely could ever African traveler have approached the city of Timbuktu with more excited curiosity than we felt in approaching this plantation. Our Indian horses seemed to participate in our joy and trotted at a smart rate towards the principal building, which at the door we leapt from our saddles just as the sun was withdrawing his ruddy light. Colonel Reeves was at home and received us with great kindness. Refreshments were immediately placed before us, and we spent the evening in agreeable conversation.
Almost from the beginning, the European settlers and their descendants brought African Americans with them to Florida, and many of them stayed after they were freed after the Civil War. One of the earliest hotels in Deland was run by the Parse family, and was located on what is now the corner of Amelia and New York Avenue. In this 1881 letter to her husband, Mrs. Parse describes the travails of running a hotel with the local help.
Dear Walter, it seems such a long time since I've heard from you. It seems to me I can't wait much longer. I'm so busy I don't get a minute to spare, as I should have written oftener myself. I've commenced 2 letters to Grandma, but did not get time to finish either. I'm getting real homesick to hear from you. Do write when you can.
I work just as hard as I can all the time. That is, as long as my strength holds out. Then I have to go to bed and rest out. Your father is very much encouraged, but I've never felt so discouraged and worn out in my life. Ada and I have the hardest of it, for our help is just miserable. The colored people here have all been farm hands and know little to nothing of housework. It's such a great care to have to see to every little thing with such a weak head as I have.
Well enshrined in local legend here is that Henry Deland was persuaded by his brother-in-law to take a very bumpy horse and buggy trip down from Enterprise to visit Captain John Rich. The captain had settled in this area shortly after his service in the American Civil War, and H.E. Deland bought some of Captain John Rich's land, which today includes the campus of Stetson University. Afterwards, he set about attracting settlers to this utopian settlement, soon to be described as the, quote, Athens of the South.
The great draw of settlers to Deland, on top of H.A.'s guarantee to buy back the land if it didn't pan out, were harvesting lumber and especially oranges. And as of today, the warm climate, as it was believed to be conducive to warm health in a way that those cold northeastern winters were not.
At the time, the river was its only inlet or outlet, and the journey to Deland was long and tedious. But that did not deter the people from coming, and when they did, they were surprised by the beauty of their surroundings and the advantages of their situation. Its pine forests were turned into orange groves. Houses sprung up in every direction. Business houses were built and occupied, and property changed hands several times a week. In some places, the demand for lumber was so great that pine trees that were standing at sunrise were cut, sawed, and nailed to the frame of a house by sunset of the very same day.
Deland is a beautiful place, and it's said to be the healthiest in the state. Built on its rolling lands amidst its tall, straight pine, its birds, its flowers, its salt air, its pure waters, it renders it a home for the tired head and the weary heart. We grew surprised to see such growth in 10 years, to see church and school buildings, the handsome dwellings, the flower gardens, the cultivation of pineapple, guava, pinto peach, bananas, grapes, and just the general thrift and growth on every side, where we expected to see a semi-wilderness.
Many over the past century and a half have described Deland, the place, as they knew it.
One of the first thoughts that I had about Deland, as I viewed it from the balcony of the Porcelain Hotel, is that it was without a doubt one of the prettiest cities in all of Florida. Deland shows every indication of having been built and designed to a very well thought out preconceived design, and it is a city of ample spaces and park-like stretches of the original pine forest and vast groves of the orange fields. From any commanding point in the city, Deland looks as if it were a massive orange plantation with a clustering town in the center and townhouses scattered amid the verdurous foliage.
I got started in the nursery business. It is not something you can develop overnight. The freezes in 1983 and 85 were really hard on the area. I lost 130 acres then. My groves ran from here to Seminole County overnight. They were gone. I remember when we used tires, and boy, that was tough. When you got through firing all night with tires, all you could see was your eyeballs, and it was really hard on your lungs. Then we used pine wood.
Not many people would recall it, but back in the early 50s, we had one of those summers where we just had rain, 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 rain. And then we had maybe 2 hurricanes, so if you think you have seen high water, you have not seen high water. Huntoon Island was underwater. Those guys that live out there now, they have no idea how much water we can have. They'd be moaning like crazy. I mean, even now, if you get high water in the river, it affects them.
Hurricane Donna happened when we had just moved back into land. I had gotten out of college in '59, and Donna hit in September of 1960. It was a mess. We had just bought a house on Orange Ave near the high school. Donna hit in the evening, and the eye came right over Deland. We came out during the eye of the storm, and as calm as could be, but what a mess. Oak trees were everywhere, and we were out of power for 3 days, but we were connected to the hospital line. But some people were out of power for 3 weeks. That was the worst hurricane I had ever expected to hit Deland.
One time I was riding way back behind the old post office, and there's a cemetery back there. There was a huge grove of magnolia trees. It was beautiful. And this is where the colored cemetery was. So I was riding my horse down there alone, and I saw a track like this. And I thought, ooh, that's a big dog. I wasn't going to go stay and meet the dog, so I turned around and came back home. I told Uncle Walter. He asked me if they had any claw marks, and I said, no, sir, it was just a big dog track. He said, Libby, that was not a dog, that was a panther. I suggest you not go down there again. He didn't have to tell me twice. I didn't go back. Panthers, when they migrated, would come through Glenwood as part of their migration path. Every once in a while, when they were migrating, you would hear them scream. You know what it is when you hear the noise and it brings the hair up on the back of your neck? The sound is something you just don't get used to.
Florida was just riddled with railroads, and nothing much is left of them, except there are places, little bits of right-of-way that have never been dealt with. Actually, if you go back here, there's a spur that ran from where this one ends, right along Ohio, across the boulevard, continued to where it is now part of Stetson, curved across Amelia, and ended at what was the College Arms Hotel. There was one that ran from Lake Helen to Blue Springs. I knew somebody who lived in Lake Helen as a kid, and they'd get on one of those hand cars. They'd find one over in the bushes or something over in Lake Helen, get on it, pump themselves over to Blue Springs, go swimming, and then go back to Lake Helen when they were through swimming. This must have been maybe in the 20s when they could still do that.
By the start of the 20th century, Deland was a firmly established city and the Volusia County seat, and so it remains to this day. Many have described their families coming to Deland and becoming established here. One of the most prominent of these early citizens was Judge Isaac A. Stewart.
Ike Stewart was pretty powerful. He was a lawyer. I think back in those days the courts went to the people because it was too difficult to get the plaintiffs, the defendants, and all that sort of stuff together. So the lawyers would ride circuit, and the judges would ride circuit with them too. And the story is that one day up north, they were riding across the river and Ike Stewart fell off his horse and caught pneumonia as a result of the hypothermia. So his doctor told him he better not ever do that again, and he picked up and moved to Florida. His wife was already familiar with the area, so he got down there, set up a law practice. That was Stewart and Bly. His partner was Grant Bly. His wife's name was Kate Brinley, and they had 2 children. We had Mary and then Tom. Tom became an attorney, then so did Mary, and this would be around 1910 or so. Tom was the younger brother and Mary was the older sister.
I have lived here since 1919. I first came here in 1918, but we came to live here in September of 1919. I didn't get back after the Great War until December of 45. I was delayed at the hospital at Cherry Point, North Carolina. The land was changed some, but not too much while I was gone. I was the city attorney when we took over the property at the air base. The day I first returned, and I was better by then, the attorney who had substituted for me, Neil Jackson, was quite ill. When I spoke to him, he wanted me to take the city commission meeting the night I first returned, and I did. There were changes, of course, and problems galore.
After Mary got her law degree, she met up with Caspar Howarth, and he was quite a bit older when she met him. She was maybe 25 when they married, and he was in his 40s. And he was apparently very funny, kind of a delightful sense of humor. And he had a heart attack when he was in his early 50s, maybe. He went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I don't know, maybe 6 months? So, the story is, on the way home, he stopped at Wanamaker's and bought a harp, because he wanted to practice up, so he told everybody. So, he went home, packed all of his things, and moved to Florida. And I still had that harp in my living room. Cass made a place for himself in this community. When he died, he was laid in state in that courthouse right there. And he was the only person I ever knew of who was buried out of that courthouse.
My father, Caspar Howarth, and Sidney Taylor's father, Dr. Harry Taylor, were very good friends. My grandfather, Judge Isaac A. Stewart, was my mother's father. He was from Kentucky but came here early in life. He was the attorney for John B. Stetson. The old Stetson house on Camper Lane would have been gone if it weren't for my mother. She couldn't stand to see the place torn down because when she was a little girl, she would play out there with the Stetson children. So she bought the house, and my mother, along with my sister and her family, lived there for several years.
I was born in Deland, in the old hospital on Stone Street in 1929. I remember very well World War II. The Deland Airport was the Naval Air Station. At the air station, the primary concern was to teach people how to fly. My father's home was the only home north of Plymouth on Orange Avenue before it connects with Stone Street, which used to be Orange Avenue all the way out.
Our family came to Deland in 1963. I had never really been in Deland prior to that time. I was recruited by the chairman of the history department, Dr. Lycan, and by Dr. McInerney, who was the dean of the university, both of whom distinguished themselves as great church lay leaders at First Baptist Church. My recollection of Deland then is of a very different community than today in some fundamental ways. When we came into town, the penny store was located at the intersection of New York and the Boulevard. I recall going in and seeing two water fountains, one saying white, the other one colored. The bus station had two waiting rooms, and the ticket window had openings to both, one for whites, one for blacks.
When we had moved into the house, it didn't have a bathroom or running water. Power wasn't really cool. It had some wiring, but it was pretty shoddy. And the people that lived there last threw up all the baseboards from the basement and threw it into the fireplace. They were surrounded by woods. But that's how those people were. They threw out all their junk in the front yard, and as nasty as it was for me, it was fascinating going through people's stuff. I mean, there were car bodies and everything out there. I didn't even think of snakes. The house was 2 stories, actually a story and a half because the ceilings were so low. Mama loved that house and didn't want Daddy to rip it apart to make a new one, so he worked on this one. He was a coal miner, a painter, and a paperer by trade, so he didn't know much about farming or how to grow anything. Then again, he didn't know really much about Florida.
I have very fond memories of my childhood here in Deland. Cly Langford was a character here in town. We didn't have any ambulances, and so they would take you to the hospital in a hearse. This was around 1940 or so. Al Kazimini was the nicest police officer in town. He was the motorcycle cop who had been here forever. Everybody loved him. He was a good man, a stern man. It was a lot easier being a policeman in those days.
Looking at what the kids do now, I was an angel. Back then, they thought I was an Indian. The people who lived in Glenwood when I was growing up were good people. If I did something wrong, they told me about it. They didn't go to Mama or Daddy. They came to me. I got the first warning, which was, "Now, Libby, your mother has raised you better than to behave like this. I better not see you do this again, or I'm going to go tell your mama." Well, then, of course, I would try to do the same thing without them noticing.
I had 2 cousins who lived in Maitland, which was just a little cow town then. They came up to see us a couple of times in a Model T Ford. They had the goggles on and all the paraphernalia of the times.
I can remember when the Athens first opened. In those days, the place was class and a beautiful spot. A Broadway play would stop and perform here for 1 or 2 nights on their way into Miami. I can remember the operetta Robin Hood playing here. During the performance, whilst Robin Hood was pouring his heart out to Maid Marian, the sheriff was sneaking up behind him. Well, my little brother couldn't take it, and he yelled out, "Look out behind you, Robin!" Well, Robin, being the professional actor that he was, didn't let this interrupt him, but he moved 2 or 3 steps out of the way to avoid the sheriff. After the play, all the youngsters praised my little brother for saving Robin Hood.
Dr. Stark and his wife were both very light-skinned. They were black, and the people at the Athens Theater said they could attend, but they'd have to sit in the balcony. They would let them attend, but nobody else. They never would attend, because if no other blacks could attend, then why me? Because I'm a doctor and my wife's a teacher, so they didn't go. It eventually opened up to where blacks could start attending the Athens Theater.
The Negro movie theater was located on West Voorhees on Wright's Corner. We also called it the Hill. We would go there sometimes on Saturday nights. When we were walking home on Rich Avenue, there was a bandshell park. A lot of young rednecks would hang out around there. They would throw rocks at us and such.
Mary was practicing law, and her brother was practicing law, who had an law office. Ike Stewart, the grandfather, Mary's father, was also practicing law. You know, he was a pretty interesting guy himself. The story was that he always kept losing his hubcaps, and apparently he always kept the hubcaps in the back of his car. And they also told me that He used to go around the county with flax seeds. You know, the flax that blooms in the spring. Well, he really liked these and threw them out the back of his car wherever he went. And that's how he populated the county with flax flowers for the spring.
Things were a lot easier back in the day. You see, I had a client by the name of Hutch Pusner. Well, one day I rang up his number in Orange City, and the operator, Mrs. Culp, answered. And I told him I needed to talk to him, and she said, well, he wasn't even home, and yet she hadn't even rung the number yet. And so she promptly went outside and shouted at some man on the street walking by and said, hey, Hutch just walked on by, and Sidney Taylor's on the phone and wants to talk to him. Couldn't beat old-fashioned courtesy and service.
My mother and father owned the Deland Hotel and ran the hotel for several years. My sister changed the name to the Landmark Hotel. The building was built back in the 20s. We never suffered when we had company because Mother and Daddy would put them down in the hotel and bring them back up for eating and so forth. Betty Hutchings and her sisters and myself and my sisters used to have more fun out at nights playing basketball in the corner. Our house was diagonally across from theirs. Where the parking lot for St. Peter's Church is now, it was the first Catholic school. They bought our house and had it in there to begin with. Then finally they built the big one they use now and tore our house down.
Whether on one side or the other, the land politics were sure to keep citizens busy and entertained.
We had the black and white Republicans, which were in the minority, and the white Democrats because the blacks were Republicans in those days. There were individuals signing the petition to change the county seat to Daytona. Fortunately, we immediately hit upon this idea with the supervisor of registration. The law said she had to charge 10 cents a photocopy of anything. They had these large photostat machines which would copy larger papers of a maximum size of pages. We arranged that if we would lay these petitions out on a larger paper, they would do a sheet for 10 cents.
On the politics, the traditions after World War II revolved around the ring and anti-ring factions. The key player was Francis P. Whitehair. He was a powerful figure and played hardball politics, creating a lot of fear and animosity.
There were groups of politicians in Deland called the Ring and the Anti-Ring. When I was a young attorney, I worked in Palm Beach and was sent up to New York City. I walked into these big offices in New York, and when they learned I was from Deland, Florida, they asked if I was Ring or Anti-Ring. They knew about it. The Ring and the Anti-Ring had both their colored supporters and their white supporters, but the colored vote is usually what swayed the ballots. They always talked about how colored people couldn't vote. They could. It just cost money or a little bit of booze or something else every time. It was delightfully corrupt in its own way.
The anti-ring were a bunch of rugged individualists who had been here longer. One story to show you how they fought. Now, remember, they used to put the voting results in the paper. In the morning, everything was fun. Husband kissed their wives goodbye as they left for the office. Friends grabbed a drink at the pharmacy as friends. But in the evening, they were all enemies. Because in the meantime, the paper had showed that the wife hadn't voted for their husband's candidate, or in some cases, the husband. The friends hadn't voted for their friends. You know, you could tell the parties of some of them by who was there first. If they were in the morning, it mean they'd be working the rest of the day. They weren't going to drop dead in the meantime. They were going to make sure they got their vote in first.
The law enforcement in the area depended on who was sheriff at the time. We've had some pretty cool ones. Back in the 50s, we had a sheriff by the name of Jimmy Tucker. He was a cowboy, and we had the worst sheriff's department you had ever seen. They were horrible. All the deputies were cowboys. They were okay. It wasn't any old thing to go out and have drag racing on a Saturday night against the deputy. It was wild, but there wasn't any great deal of crime. I don't know if people thought they were just so comical that they could commit a crime and just die laughing or what. I know a lot of deputies now, and they are all good men, hardworking and dedicated.
Law enforcement was always good and efficient. Some people may complain, but I actually find it less responsive now than it used to be to the people. Policemen were more polite, but the general public had more respect for authority. If a deputy sheriff or policeman told you to stop something, you stopped it. You didn't run, you didn't fight, you didn't ignore him. For example, I remember this one night before the war. I was in the courthouse late at night, and Joe Shadburn, who was a deputy sheriff at the time, got a call. There had been a killing out on Spring Hill, and he asked me if I wanted to go with him. I said, sure, and we hopped in his car and went on down there. Here at this juke joint, there was a bunch of colored people hollering and carrying on. Joe walked in, and they made way for him. There was a man lying across the table. He had fallen over and blood was running out of his head. They pointed out the killer, and Joe turned to him and said, "Now, you know I'm going to have to take you to jail, right?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Joe." And he got in the car and went to jail. Now they go in with armament and without advance notice break into places. The point is, drunk or sober, when a policeman told you to do something, you did it because people respected authority, because they knew the authority had the power and they didn't want that power used on them. They could have shot them, and there were shootings, but that was when the shooting was called for, though.
A black officer couldn't arrest any white law-breaking citizen. They can only arrest black law-breaking citizens. It got to the point where any law-breaking citizen could be arrested, but before any arrest could be made, a black officer had to call up a white officer to be there with him before he wrote it up.
At the time, the politics of the county in large measure revolved around the sheriff. The sheriff's election, I think next to that of the election of the President of the United States, was the election which attracted the most voters. There were a great many colorful sheriffs who came and went in this period before the writing of the Volusia County Charter in 1969. The sheriff's deputies were appointed based on patronage, and they would often campaign in their uniforms and with their guns, mainly in black precincts. Until roughly then, the offices in which we are talking about were operated by a fee system. If you didn't arrest some brawlers on a Saturday night, you didn't get paid. So if you had a new car or something you needed to pay off, you would go on a binge enforcing the law. The evils of the fee system are well ingrained within the traditional Old South government and politics.
We had a panel of the Supreme Court sitting down here for a case with a fight over at the ballots sometime. It was really wonderful. It was really interesting. Well, we had no television, you see. The excitement was in the case and all. The people would come from all over the county, come and watch it, then go out at noon to have lunch and then talk about the case. If we were really lucky, we'd get a really good murder case. It was no Raymond Burr, but we had local talent.
Part of my memories are the wonderful things they did. Some of these things would be absolutely outlawed now. For instance, we had one attorney from New Smyrna who was just an old country boy. He would lay it on for fare ye well. He used to chew tobacco, and in those days, we had spittoons all over the courthouse, particularly in the courtroom. One of his tricks was, when the opposing witness was about to say something important, he would make a funny little sound, and the jury would all look at him. Then he would cut loose and spit at the spittoon 5 feet away from him, and he would always hit with a ding. But they always looked to see if he made it. They didn't hear what the witness said then.
When things got really heated one time, the prosecutor had just gotten the witness to seeing the gun fired and the man fallen. The witness is testifying, and old Zach was sitting lean back in his chair. All of a sudden, he fell over backwards. Clatter-bang! Of course, he got up and apologized to the court, apologized to the jury, apologized to the judge, apologized to the witness, apologized to the court reporter. Said he was so sorry and that he'd be able to carry on in spite of his back. He kept putting on an act until the rest of the court had forgotten what the witness had said. That's what he was doing, and we all knew it and tolerated it. It was just terrible, but sort of the old style.
The way of life for most black guys was to go to the local hot spots around town and play music till about 2 or 3 in the morning. Then they'd go home, they'd take care of their families, they'd get some rest, and then they'd get back up for work the next day. I spent my first year in Deland living with my aunt and uncle.
I had always wanted to play the saxophone, but I was reluctant because it had so many more keys than the trumpet. But after I quit the trumpet, I found that I could play the saxophone.
There was a time when the racial tension was prominent in Deland. The integration movement was at an all-time high. The Negro movie theater was located on West Voorhees on Wright's Corner. There have been times when I was on Rich Avenue, and before I got to Woodland Boulevard, the KKK would be standing there. Somebody of the crowd would say, "Hey, don't bother him, that's Cook's grandson."
The black race had been trained in such a way. If you're not careful, you end up going back 40 years and walk into that same mentality.
The story of most Southern towns during the first half of the 20th century is incomplete without the mention of the rise of segregation and the presence of the Ku Klux Klan, and Deland was no different.
I was one of the rare Catholics who were raised in Deland. There were only 2 others in my class, my cousin and the meanest guy in the whole school. Across the street from my house, there was this guy named Emery Carter, who had a garage and was the head of the Ku Klux Klan here. He and I were good friends. He and my oldest brother were very dear friends. We never had any problems with the Klan and got along with everyone.
My father was the rector of the Episcopal Church. The rector of the Episcopal Church in Daytona had a son who was a reporter for the News Journal. They were theoretically invited to a Possums Club meeting in New Smyrna, which was a political meeting. At the meeting, when they came in, some men hit Stanley Walker. A fist went right into his face as he came in and broke his glasses into his eyes. He fell down and they started kicking him in the back. He was crippled from then on. I sat through the trial with my mother and father to show them our support. They were regarded as courageous, but it was just because they were 2 fellow priests at the larger churches in the county. There was a lot of political wrangling at the time, but the ones on trial were finally acquitted. We still think they did it.
The KKK also took exception to Baptists being involved with Catholics. And there was this one story about a young man that was Catholic being involved with a good Baptist girl, and the story was that the KKK got hold of him and castrated him. And my father-in-law, the one that was married to my mother-in-law, who was around Deland all the time, knew everybody, went hunting with everybody, he told me that there were black people that were picked up for one reason or another and put on the train down to Benson Junction into Barry, on that old rail line that ran through there, and dumped out of the train. And then somewhere along that old Enterprise route, there were places where bodies were disposed of.
Ike Stewart always claimed he believed in the Constitution, and by that he meant to say that everybody was equal, so he would represent black people. I don't know anything in particular, but I do know he had the reputation of representing people who were otherwise not so well represented around here. And so I suppose he wound up on the wrong side of a lot of discussions, I guess.
So at the time, the story was at 6 at night, if there was going to be a meeting, the lights would flip off and on in Deland. And so the KKK members knew that there was going to be a meeting. So Ike Stewart and his wife, Kate, one night, saw the lights flip off and later on there was a knock on the door, and Ike Stewart answered. The person said, "You've been marked for death." And Ike asked, "Any more?" According to the person who sent the information, the fire chief had been selected to take care of Ike.
Ike was not a very tall man. If you've seen pictures of him, he was about this big and about this big around. Next morning, Ike is on the courthouse steps, standing up there. Everybody was up and about because they didn't have television and there was nothing to divert them but to get up and walk around or go out and have breakfast or something. "What are you doing here so early, Ike?" "I've come to get my pistol permit. I've been marked for death." "Okay, so what if they shoot you and you're on the ground?" And he said, "I'm from Kentucky and I shoot from the ground." Well, he got his pistol permit. He carried a revolver with him for a while.
So then, the story is, every morning or once a week or something, he'd come down from his apartment and go down to in front of the firehouse, and he'd stand there with his pistol, and he'd spin the cylinder on it and then stick his hog back in his pocket and go home. Well, the story is the fire chief just couldn't live with it, and he wound up in Chattahoochee for a while, the state insane asylum. He could never work again. It just drove him nuts. Well, that's the story. I mean, it's a good tale. I don't know if it's true.
Judge Stewart was, as you can tell, a kind of unusual person. He'd walk around town talking to himself, and somebody would say, "Judge, who you talking to?" And he'd say, "I'm talking to the smartest man I know." He was just funny.
I soon learned the tradition was that black patrons sat in one area and whites in another. At least, one of my acquaintances who practiced medicine was a very enlightened person because he treated blacks, but likewise, the nurses' station had a window that opened to 2 separate waiting rooms, one for blacks and one for whites. Now, this was before the enactment of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and was during a period of rather tempestuous civil rights agitation in Florida. At Stetson, there was a great awareness of racial justice, or in this community, the apparent lack of it. So many faculty members joined in marches and demonstrations to indicate where they stood.
We had a semi-pro baseball team which I managed when I came back to Deland. We practiced and played in Conrad Park just like it was our own. There were a lot of whites in town who were not happy about that.
I learned from Dr. McInerney that Stetson was the first college in all of Florida to integrate, to enroll a black student voluntarily. And to him, it wasn't a matter of being politically correct or not, but rather what was morally dictated. So I came to Stetson at a time where a lot of my peers were highly energized on the whole race issue thing, and, well, in general, the whole issue of justice and humaneness.
There were a lot of very influential black people in Deland, like the Wright family. Now, Tony Wright was a man you'd call Mr. Wright for the mass amount of land holdings he had. But during the Depression, he lost everything. All the money he lent to the whites, he never got back. The whites got their half back, but he never got his. He used to have this big mansion on the corner of West Minnesota with a huge orange grove. My wife's mother used to live there on the corner of 15A and Minnesota Ave, near the Stetson Baptist Church. There's a lot of history missing in them history books, which is unfair. Everyone should know who helped build this town.
My name is Noble Watts. After I got to New York, I took the thin man out because I was doing jazz. All of a sudden, I started working less. I had a girlfriend up there, a girl I'd gone to college with. She said, put that name back in and you'll start getting calls. She made up some thin man cards and the phone started ringing. I'll die with that name now. I ain't ashamed.
During the time of segregation, the black schools did not get any new textbooks, from what I understood. They got textbooks that had been used at the high school and other schools and passed on to Euclid High School at Bronson. Same thing used to happen with football equipment. They just weren't funded the same way that other schools were. I think it was only up until when they started desegregation that the schools began to start getting new textbooks, new equipment without too much of a problem, because of the mixture of races going to the school at the time.
There was a time when they didn't let any of us go into any restaurants. We went to a restaurant out between Deland and De Leon Springs, and we were served. After we were done eating and they took the plates and things, they broke the plates back in the back. There were blacks who worked in the kitchen, and they told us what had happened. There was another restaurant in town, and it's family-owned, and we went to the front door to go in. They would not let us in, but they told us that we can go to the back to get what we wanted. We didn't purchase anything, and they almost pleaded for us to go to the back door to get what we wanted. Right now, the restaurant is still in business and is still family-owned. And we can go in the front door.
You get to know people when you eat with them. You get to know who they are, who their family is, and they get to know you and your family. And if anybody speaks ill of you, well, I know better because I know you. Come to think of it, that's probably why they didn't want us to sit together.
My grandfather was involved in the orange groves. In fact, he was one of the few black persons in the area to own his own equipment. That's how I learned to do mechanic work and how to drive. By the age of 10, I could tear down a tractor and put it back together again. Grandfather used to take me out around town with him. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. When it came time to cut the orange groves, he had confidence in me. He would tell me to run the tractor while he would go get a drink of water.
In downtown Deland, there was a JCPenney store down where the Table restaurant is today. There were colored and white water fountains. Walking by, I said to myself, let's taste some of this white water. And you know what? It didn't taste any different.
World War II was a very memorable time for some residents, particularly those who attended Stetson University as students.
During the war years at Stetson, there was a select group of young men called the Star Unit. These were chosen, intelligent young men with great futures in the Army. They housed at Stetson and ate their meals at the Commons there, too. They did their studies and their schooling at Stetson. The Star Unit had a lot of activities for these servicemen to do. One time they had a contest. They would select from Stetson the girl they wanted from a package from home. I was selected as the girl. Photos were taken of the two men helping me out of the box. You know, there weren't a lot of boys at Stetson. About 4 girls for every 1 boy. Of course, the Navy base was there.
Harold said during the war years, the Stetson girl students were always so pretty and dressed so ladylike. We didn't need a dress code. The girls wore dresses and jumpers or skirts and blouses to school. It was the thing to let your saddle shoes stay scuffed up, but one of the things that Harold used to notice about me was that I would polish mine so they were immaculate. When I was a girl at Stetson and needed a little extra money, I would go around to some of the girls who did have money and polish their saddle Oxfords for 10 cents a pair. I would earn maybe $1 a week. My parents were not money people by a long shot. They were very proud people, but no matter what, we would share with others. I can remember bringing vegetables to people to share.
When I was a kid, we had a dive bomber go into the lake behind my dad's house. We lived across the street from the old Daytona Road where it dead ends on 17. The dive bomber actually crashed into our lake. My cousin and my brother, who are both older than me, went down there and got a machine gun out of the plane. They went to my cousin's house and cleaned the gun up. They had the gun for a while, and then the Navy found out about it and went to go get it. We're still finding pieces of the plane down there after 40-some years.
There were other crashes during the war. There is still a dive bomber at the bottom of Lake Woodruff right now. I saw the plane in the water. On a bright day, you can see the silver of the plane at the bottom of Lake Woodruff. There were, of course, other crashes at the base itself in training these pilots to fly. They were training them for carrier duty.
Something I will never forget are the letters which the mothers would write to their boys in the service. One family lived on Minnesota Avenue, or near there. Carl Harris was a contemporary of mine, and we had grown up together. I will never forget the day I had to return the letters his mother had written to him because he had been killed in action. It was just a sad, sad time. One saw a difference in the student body during this time. Those returning were no longer interested in hazing. When a student came back from war, he had been in combat and was there to study and get on with their lives. This was evident in the student body. There was a seriousness and purpose. Both of us, before we were married, were more interested in courting than studying. When we returned, it was a different thing. Honor roll and dean's list.
The campus wasn't as strict as the school was under old President Allen. Still in all, they didn't allow any drinking around there. The girls had to be in their dorms by 11 on weekdays and no later than midnight on the weekends. You would have to kiss them goodnight on the veranda. You better not make it too long of a kiss, because the old girl would be standing there watching you. They were pretty strict on those girls.
The eve of our wedding rehearsal, after it was over, Harold and I took Dad's car out on a little country road, which was as far as Deland went in those days. There wasn't much out south of town. We went on this little country road to pray about our lives together and smooch a little bit, though Harold always says he doesn't know which we did the most. There's a little flea market there near Beresford Avenue, and I always say as we drive past, they are desecrating holy ground.
The Conrads live right next to us. They had a couple of black fellows working for them. They were great guys. They sort of treated us like we were their own kids, you know? We would go fishing with them all the time, and we would catch fish, and we would give them fish, and, you know, we would do all kinds of nice favors for them. I didn't think much about the segregation issue until I was in the service, really. Of course, when you're on the other side and you can't drink out of a fountain, then you would notice something. The Korean War broke out when I was getting out of high school, so I went into the Army. After the war, I went to the University of Florida on the GI Bill. I didn't know what I wanted to do until about my junior year in college. Lorraine and I were thinking about getting married around that time.
They had prisoners of war, Germans at the airbase out there. Occasionally, You would go by and see a uniform on one of them with a big white printed POW on the back. He wouldn't be guarded, but he would be doing something along the fence or something in the base itself. It was quite a time.
I was the first from a mail carrier in Deland. The post office was next to the band shell. My husband and I thought we were going to get married in 45, and I was done with Stetson until the fall term, looking for some work. I walked by the post office one day, and there was a big sign out front about needing a worker.
The post office was a red brick building in a style you would find in many small towns. It would go up 7 or 8 steps to the door. So I went in and asked Mr. Anderson about the job. And he said, "Rabel, it's for a mail carrier. We can't use a girl." Then he looked at me and said, "You know what? We will give you a try." And so I went out and became Deland's first woman mail carrier.
I was a novelty to people. I wore slacks, and I still have my Frank Buck helmet hat. I had long hair, very thick at the time and down as far as my knees, so I would loop it up and have it in sort of a pigtails to keep the hair out of my face, and so I was comfortable and cool. It seems I had to be in there at 7 o'clock. I had to be there in time to have everything out and ready by 8 o'clock. The ladies on my route always seemed to take pity on me, so they would have food for me along the way. It's a wonder I didn't get as fat as a cow in those days, but I didn't. And it's because I was out getting exercise and breathing deeply.
Stetson has always been fortunate. When I went to Stetson as an undergrad, it was all dirt. There was no grass or anything like landscaping. Now they have beautified the lawns and improved all the buildings.
The period of the Great War and those years after it were years of profound change for the people of Deland and Stetson. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement was felt in town as it was in the other parts of the country.
I can remember once when the kids started demonstrating downtown. They were going into either McCrory or Woolworths and sitting at the lunch counters because they were not open to blacks.
So we decided we were going to walk from the Euclid School down past the Wright Building on Voorhees Avenue, which at the time was a hub for black business and culture, go down Florida Avenue to New York Avenue, go into downtown Deland, and take a seat at the soda shop. The town was in an uproar. They were going crazy. They heard about our plan and were just in an uproar.
A group of Negro young people marched to Woolworth's Variety Store in Deland again yesterday, but found the lunch counter closed. They crossed the street to McCrory's Variety Store, but all the seats there were filled with white persons, and so the Negro group marched out again and dispersed. Woolworth's lunch counter was closed all day, and the seats roped off since the Negro teenagers went to the store Thursday and sat on all 27 seats. Yesterday's demonstration, like Thursday's, was quiet and orderly.
These kids from the high school went in there and sat at the lunch counter, and they closed the counter up and stopped serving. As soon as they left and went out, they opened up and started serving again. The kids went in again, and instead of walking right out, they stayed a much longer time. They put up signs saying closed, and they stayed closed.
The police officers protected us. They stood as a barrier between us and the people who wanted to get to us. I remember the staff at the lunch counter were so nervous. Even our parents were a little nervous. Most of them did domestic work for the people who wanted to get to us. It's always the young who make the changes, who move things forward. And back then, I was young.
They eventually started serving blacks at the lunch counters here.
One thing I haven't mentioned is the drive-in theater that was in Deland some time ago. There was a time where no blacks could come in there. What we would do, some friends of mine and a young lady, Dr. Stark's daughter, who was very light-complected with straight hair, she and I would sit in the front seat, so I would drive up to the ticket window and ask for 4 tickets. There would be a couple in the back that would be as dark as I don't know what. We would ask for 4 tickets. They would see the 2 of us. Then they would look in the back and see the other 2. They would say, "Wait, let me go get my manager." They would come back, and the manager would say as much as they would like to, they just couldn't give us the tickets. This gave us the opportunity to go in and cruise through slowly. We kept doing this over a period of time, and eventually they just started letting us in.
Just to move the clock a little faster, I had moved into more participation in the church when the issue of admitting blacks to worship was faced, along the lines of whether blacks could be admitted as members or not. Now, this went to a vote of the church, and I guess I'm glad to say the church voted to admit blacks as members, but The margin was a bare majority. This caused instability in the church. Many of the old-timers left or threatened to leave. One or two of them, who are still alive, I have noticed in later years have reconciled and returned to some degree of participation in the church. This is one of the very vigorous memories I have of this community early on.
Deland was very much so part of the old Florida and of the old South. And I'm not trying to demean these traditions, but a lot of my peers were having trouble adjusting to this period. Remember that the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, made by the Supreme Court, was only a decade prior. And these changes were creating a much noticeable stress on the country.
Overall, the teachers I had were very good. I hated school. It was a good thing they were dedicated. I enjoyed learning, but it was having to be there at certain classes at certain times and changing classes at certain times and eating lunch at certain times. It was so regimented. I would be in one class so bored waiting for the other students to understand the work, and then I would go to math and just feel like the teacher left me in the dust. The kids in the neighborhood go to the nearest school. It worked so much better than it does now. They shared classes, they shared playtime. The parents knew the other parents. They went all the way through school until they graduated and had been best of friends this whole length of time.
Therefore, when everyone started talking about integration, I said, what's the problem? Why make a thing out of this? They did it wrong. If we were in each other's company, and then we would decide whether we were friends or not. We should never be enemies. I think the government got too much involved.
I grew up in Deland and attended what was then the Euclid School for Coloreds from 1st to 12th grade. I was curious, always, about the separation of schools. What was so different between me and you? Why could we be friends, but when time came for school, why did you go to your school and I went to the colored school?
I can recall a time when I worked at Bonner Elementary in Daytona. The year of desegregation, Claude Kirk was governor, and he indicated that he was not going to let integration happen. At the school where I was principal, he was supposed to come down, stand in front of the door to keep other kids from coming in, just like George Wallace did out in Alabama. I'll tell you, every media was there, news media and television. Each channel, 2, 6, 9, the New York Times, others. Just so happened, Kirk didn't show up. But one of the media got there late. Everybody was in class, and everything was running as smooth as clockwork. But he wanted to take some pictures of the kids, so I got some of them out of the media center and had them come out and stand around me with a clipboard. He took pictures of us. Then he wrote up the article as if to say there was mass chaos and that I was trying to unravel the confusion. There was no chaos and there's no confusion. From that point on, I never gave any information to that newspaper anymore. If they were going to write as much negative as they possibly could, why give them something to take out of context? They could write what they want, but they wouldn't get it from me.
There was an active KKK group here in Deland, and in fact, I think there still is. We always had a big Christmas parade. Big, you know? One parade band goes by, a group of maybe 15 KKK members in regalia. What was interesting was it was right in front of the president's house at Stetson. Starting at the top of the hill, they come down the boulevard and people turned their backs on them. They got real quiet while they went by. And I knew somebody. My daughter's husband's mom had just moved down from New Jersey, I guess. She said, I couldn't believe it. She said, this is the 1970s. Well, at the time, the sheriff was a guy who had worked for the FBI for a long time, had retired, was an attorney. And anybody who enters this parade, they file a form, so he had advance warning that this was going to happen. He was real clever. He thought, these guys ought to be escorted. And he got 2 of his biggest, blackest deputies, put them on motorcycles, and they rode down the boulevard ahead of this group. Well, that was pretty cool. Like, it's finesse that matters.
I hate to see any of the old buildings torn down. I personally feel that the county administration building doesn't go along with the rest of the land. This sounds like I'm against progress, but I'm not. People come to Deland, and the reason they come to Deland is for what it is like. the atmosphere, and the relationship with Stetson University. I am unhappy to have people come here and try to change so much about what is meaningful to so many of us. They are not yet to the point in their lives when these things are meaningful.
It has been a wonderful time in my life. A productive time of seeing much improvement and reform in the city, in crying along with others who have lost opportunity and had failures, but in seeing my University of Stetson become such a central force in the community, to the present point where the university shares in partnership in many undertakings with the community. You may say, Deland is a work in progress.
I think that Deland is headed for a better place. I'm really impressed with what has progressed so far. And I think that when you look at Deland, including the city, you're looking in the right direction.
As I look forward, I just know that folks like those hearing this right now are going to be the ones to push things to a better day.
And here we are, near the end of our journey, with a good start into the 21st century and new challenges to meet.
What we seek in history is what we may find in the future.
In many ways, history is used to guide us through troubles and to bring success into a foreseeable future.
Since Deland laid its first brick to the numerous lives and homes we drive by now, many steps have been taken to get us to this point.
From agriculture to world culture.
Our history has never been more important than now.
Our goal is to remember the events of the past, to appreciate and even bring to light the progress of our community.
While our steps to success have been small, they have most certainly been mighty.
Deland has been and will continue to be a place of change, progress, and unity.
As we all stand here, we will eventually become the past.
A brief moment.
A snapshot.
A glimpse in time of how Deland changed since the very beginning.
However, we all stand united here as the future.
While we all imagine what the town could be, we reflect on its past to find ways to grow even stronger than before.
We are the future of our corner of Florida. And as a student,
A stage manager.
An actor.
A leader.
A motivator.
A writer.
A researcher.
An activist.
We will always remember.
And we will strive never.
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 To disappoint.